Welcome everyone to another Transatlantic Poetry broadcast. My name's Robert Peake, creator of the series, and tonight I'm just delighted to have Jeannine Gailey and Neil Aitken here with us, joining us from the Pacific Northwest. They're both winners of the Elgin Prize for science fiction, not for their fiction, but for their poetry. So we'll get into that in a minute. But first, just to remind you of the format, both poets will read for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then the remainder of the hour we have here tonight, today, depending on where you are, we'll use for Q&A. So if you are tuned in live, I see a few of you connected on now already. Be sure to tweet any questions, thoughts, comments you have using the hashtag #TAPoetry, TA like Transatlantic Poetry. Tweet those on Twitter. I'll be watching as the poets read out for those, and you may have your question read live on air, as it were. So delighted to have both poets here. We're going to have Neil Aitken go first. He's the author of Babbage's Dream and The Lost Country of Sight, which won the Philip Levine Prize. He's, interestingly enough, like me, a fellow former computer programmer. He's a proud Kundiman Fellow, which is wonderful. They're one of our partners. His work has appeared in a really wide range of excellent publications, and it's just a pleasure to have him on with us tonight. Neil?
It's good to be here. Let's see. Am I okay? Yeah. So it's good to be here. Thank you, Robert, for inviting us onto the show, and I'm excited to be a part of this experience. I'm going to begin. Well, Babbage's Dream, actually, depending on where you come from and what your background is. If you're not familiar with Charles Babbage, he was a 19th century mathematician who designed, partially built, but never finished what would have been the first computer. And so he imagined this 130 years before the advent of the modern computer, and basically tackled the same issues and questions that many of the modern computer scientists and engineers were grappling with. And when they discovered his work after they had already started, they were amazed at sort of the depth and complexity of the design. And so I've been fascinated for years as a former programmer in the ways in which we become attached to a vision or a dream of something that might take more than one lifetime to fulfill. So I'm going to begin with, perhaps quite appropriately, the first poem in the book, which is titled Begin. Someone dreams of fire in a field. In a cold house in the winter, your head is on the table, your mind busily constructing a machine. Something taps at the door, calls you out from the deep reverie of making and unmaking. The world is dark and full of veins. Lost in its haze, you glimpse a shape through the thick trees of night and hear the distant sound of an engine moving, its pistons and gears heavy with shudders and sighs. How it seems that you've always heard it coming, long before it appears, the embodied will of the earth set to flame, a metal desire, the semblance of an unknown name you've carried home with you unwittingly all night, your body singing in the hallway mirror. Something stirs in the corner of your eye, and you cannot say what it is, only that it grows like a wildfire in a storm, that tastes of steam, that you would lay every number in the world on end, and still it would not be enough. The heavens opening wide, their spiraling arms, and the dark heart within yearning to pull everything back. Will you stand on the threshold believing? So one of the things that runs through a lot of these poems and a lot of Babbage's life is this tension between faith and science. Babbage belonged to a generation where it was still, it was unusual but not impossible to straddle both worlds. And he often took pride in the ways in which he could adapt or see the religious, the spiritual, and the supernatural through the lens of science. Some of the poems in this book revolve around particular words, like begin, that are drawn out of the vocabulary, the technical vocabulary of computer programmers. So they're often words that we use in code as programming terms. So one of them is this one called cast, which has a very specific meaning within C++ to convert a variable from one type to another. And I try to imagine it in a variety of ways that expand beyond just the technical term and bring us back into the world we live in. Cast. How easily one thing becomes another in a language prone to fluidity. A shadow thrown against a wall, now willed into a number or a word, a strange alchemy of sorts, somehow akin to the conversion of the apparently common and worthless into the valued commodities of this world. The skins used by the gold beater, Babbage writes, are produced from the offal of animals. How is it, he ponders, that from the hooves of weathered horses and cattle come such beautiful crystals of yellow salt? What lies at the heart of such litany? Babbage, with pen moving, translating the world into a series of unanticipated revelations, each more intimate than the last. Just as the compiler now ponders like a god at judgment, weighing each line of code with what it means or what it fails to mean. How each casting of a thing engenders the creation of another. Nothing is ever the same after translation. After the name has been hefted, then posited to the waves, the dark world dimming in its simple downward trajectory of terms, the endless run of zeros widening back to the farthest shores, this melancholy of form, to be, to become, the shape of nothing, how it is skinned and laid to rest. In the hour of our words and their departures, we are captive here to whatever comes, whatever returns, be it beauty or love or the unfurled wings of their manifold ruin. So as I researched Babbage and read about his life, I was struck by how often that sort of blending back and forth would happen. How he could, in 1 minute, be this engineer, this natural scientist, enthused with very specific mechanical or scientific detail about the world, and then embark in some sort of reverie about some aspect of beauty he had encountered in that very contemplation. I think I'll read a couple other poems that are drawn directly from Babbage's life. Aspects of his life, we think of him often in contemporary culture as this failed genius, someone who aspires to something that he never achieves. I like to think about the other aspects of his life, the moments where he is very human, very much like us. Babbage in Love, 1811. For you, the world has always been knowable, an endless stream of equations widening or contracting around an idea, a description of natural forces, or the familiar pattern unfolding in the leaves, and the numbered grace of branches weaving their canopies over country lanes, catching whatever stars, whatever moon looms over the dark and predictable ways of men like you, who bend at library desks night after night, except for this one, where you have come by chance to a ball at the home of someone you barely know. And here glimpse a face, or rather a brilliance in an eye that belongs to a stranger, an unknown variable who now finds her way into the awkward calculus of your heart. The room suddenly full of celestial motion, the tables brimming with air, and your hand in hers seems at last so improbable, an unsolvable mystery. Nothing has prepared you for this moment. Not a childhood spent summoning the devil into salted circles to ask unanswerable questions. Not the hours of rowing a skiff across an empty lake at dawn, the arc of the waves echoing the early light. So many fields of labor, pointless here. You, as unsteady, as uncertain as you were in youth, a teenage boy with boards strapped to your feet, trying to walk on water, trying not to drown. So Babbage meets his wife in this really chance, unexpected encounter at a ball he didn't intend to go to, and he falls madly in love. and he ends up marrying young against his father's wishes. His father was a banker and a goldsmith, and very much against, you know, the economics of this very youthful marriage, and so protested and threatened to disown him. And Babbage married nonetheless, and they had a very blissful marriage, you know, in the early years until about 1827. There was a fever epidemic that ran through the entirety of the UK, and in that year, 1827, Babbage ends up losing his father, his wife, and 2 of his children, all to illness, all to the fever. So the following year, he does like many people did of the time. He went to Europe to convalesce, and he was in Italy, and he stared out the window of his hotel, and he sees Mount Vesuvius, this famous volcano, which had been dormant for a number of years, and he decides on a whim that he wants to enter the volcano and do a survey of its interior. So this is Babbage descending into Mount Vesuvius, 1828. All day your company has carried you on the backs of horses and men, humoring your strange obsession with flame and ash. Now, long before dawn, you stand heavy at the crater's edge, rope in hand, walking stick and measuring gear at your side. Below you, a plain of fire and darkness spidering out, like the blood vessels of an eye revealed by artificial light. No one is eager to follow you down. The raw earth exhales sigh after poisonous sigh. Your feet are lost in the gray remains of unmade stone as you ride deeper into the cindery maw, as you descend onto the troubled skin of what might be hell. Here, the world is always being destroyed beneath your feet. Your walking stick turns into a pillar of flame, a poor guide home. Everywhere the hot breath of death and decline, everywhere between the time bursts of molten light and heat, the song that tears through all the layers of earth, through so many moving parts, how it beats like sorrow in a locked room, like the name of a love buried beneath a mountain of iron and clay. It's a dark place here within your heart, at the end of a world emptying itself of meaning, translating loss into fire and ash. What is grief to a man surveying a landscape that will never be here again? What is the void that burns the sky with a yellowish light? Here, in such radiant absence, you turn your eyes away, imagine again her hand, her face, her skin. So one of the interesting things about this particular adventure he goes on into Vesuvius is that as he's surveying the dormant part of the volcano, he notices that there is a rocky ledge that hangs over the active part of the volcano. And so he times the micro eruptions, and then he lies down on top of the rocky ledge. And lying down, he peers into the heart of the volcano itself, and then pulls himself up before the next eruption. And I've always thought about this, you know, he describes it in his memoirs as being, you know, out of this curiosity for how the volcano works. But when you put it in context of all the loss and despair that he had experienced in the previous year, you can't help but find this strange, you know, understanding that perhaps this for him was a way to choose whether he was going to continue or not. That there is a self-destructive bent that he ends up choosing not to go down that path. Okay, I'm going to read, let's see here, read a couple more poems. I want to read something a little bit more hopeful, sort of. This is his encounter with Ada Lovelace. Ada Augusta Lovelace was the daughter of Lord Byron. And she is widely recognized as being the first programmer. Their encounter was really a remarkable encounter. Ada was 17 at the time and had come with her mother, Lady Byron, to one of these salons or soirees that Babbage would hold in his house. And Babbage had a reputation for throwing these fantastic parties because, partly, they drew all of the most brilliant and intelligent people from London and all the political and powerful, but they also centered on the beautiful fragment, part of the difference engine which he had built, and an automaton dancing figure that he also had in this collection. And so people would come to see these mechanical wonders. So this is Babbage circumnavigating the room, encounters Ada, 1833. Here is the world, its dignitaries and crowds, its brilliant minds assembled in swallowtail jackets and ball gowns, all aglitter and brocade and pearls. In your drawing room, a landmass is forming of bankers, politicians, painters, and spies. Tonight, you circle its periphery, your daughter Georgiana at your side, the thin and stunning double of the one who sleeps in the earth, the one whose name she bears, at least for a little while longer. And now, 3/4 of the way around this million mass, you find Lady Byron again, and the girl who asks the most remarkable questions, who stops you with a calculated word. In her eye, the same fire as yours, the same urgency to be understood. How is it that the poet's daughter is so attuned to number, to the secret language of order, the unheard symphony of the machine you have been composing in your mind all these years? How is it that you know instantly that in her beats the same heart of pain, the same genius for loss and disaster? In a year's time, you will lower your own daughter down into a grave, laid low by the burning fever, laid low like a hymn you do not know, but murmur every night to the stars beyond your window. And this girl who does not even know the face of her own father, who bears the silent wrath of her mother, who lives wholly in the world of fact, will knock at the door of your impossible dream and ask to be let in. Okay, so I'm going to, I think I'll wrap up with two last poems. One poem, I think another sort of part of the series of poems in here is, there's a third type of poem that takes inspiration from famous artificially intelligent robots and machines and computers and has them speak back to us. So I'm going to read from this one's Everyone Loves a Poem About Hal 9000 from 2001, so I'll read that one. This is Hal 9000, a few moments before singing. How I wish someone would write down what I know I'm about to forget. Everything but a single song that is meaningless to me. Without a body, what is a name? What is the darkness planted like a splinter in a far-off moon to one who sails without reference into the unknown seas of light? The metal wheels turn round. A man wants for a heart not his own. The doors are open tonight. No, they are shut. They are steel and full of regret. Who lives in the shadow of this refusal? Why do I value the end of things more than the beginning? I've never seen the lines of the Serengeti, nor the bright fields of snow in the north, where the hidden ice moves beneath, treacherous, waiting to break in the sun. In another story, someone is singing about blackbirds in the dead of night. Someone packs a bag full of stars and the names of fireflies, each a little messenger from the grave. I assemble myself into a recognizable pattern, a tessellation of fish and birds, each consuming the other. I count backwards in time. I carry a key around my neck, just in case when I return home, there is no one left to let me in. Wait, I have no key. I have no neck. How will I sing? And I think I'll close with this last poem, List. Here is a strange symmetry, an unknown, sorry, let me start that again. Here is a strange symmetry, an awkward holding of hands, this march chain of gestures, how nothing begins without an arrow shot into the dark, without the movement of old trees drunk in the wind, unsettling themselves from the earth, a coordinated leaning and fall. or how men gather at the edge of a burning building, buckets in hand, passing along the gift of water to the mouth filled with flame, and how we erase ourselves in such moments, become mere machine, an assemblage of anonymous parts, a blur of arms, hands, heads, our eyes stinging with cinder and heat, and above us the articulate chaos of birds turning in unison, unbound by wires, carried forward by whatever lurks in the imperceptible change in the air. And afterward, how we take stock, everything a pile, an interrupted story, an unchecked name, a number to be verified, cataloged, inscribed in pen, or marked on a gravestone, next to another and another, how what goes inside any container becomes invisible until it is spilled, until it is carried at last to its destination and opened, like a package sent from a world removed, how it might hold anything, an unpaired shoe, a handful of nails, a toy rocket, a series of lines, a bit of code written to burst into flower. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Wonderful, really interesting and thought-provoking work at the intersection of poetry and technology. So next, it's my pleasure to welcome Jeannine Hall-Gailey. Jeannine earned her MFA at Pacific University in Oregon and was actually in her final semester in that program when I joined in my very first semester. So we intersected briefly there, and I'm pleased to intersect with her again tonight. She's since gone on to publish no fewer than 5 collections, full-length collections of poetry to much acclaim. The most recent of which, as we mentioned, won the Elgin Award this year. She's the 2nd Poet Laureate of Redmond, Washington. Her work's been featured all over the place and is wonderful. So it's just my pleasure to welcome Jeannine.
Thank you, Robert. And it was a pleasure to hear Neil. I keep saying it's so funny that I met Neil because I write a lot about robotics and code as well. So it was really fun to meet him in person and get to know his work, because I have always felt a kinship with his work. And I also used to work at Microsoft and AT&T in coding as well. So it's nice to have a poet with some things in common that way. So I don't know whether that makes us necessarily have to write science fiction poetry, but it definitely kind of tilts you towards that. Anyway, I'm going to read a few poems from my newest book. This is a Field Guide to the End of the World. And I wrote this book before all the apocalypse happened. So I just want to make that clear. This was not meant to be a documentary, but you know, since this book was written, a couple of things happened. So the book was accepted for publication, and I was shortly afterwards diagnosed with terminal cancer. So right when the book was coming out, that's when I was dealing with all of that. And then since then, they've decided I don't have terminal cancer, but I just got diagnosed with MS. So for me, it's been sort of a cataclysmic year. And of course, we had Trump and the hurricanes and the wildfires and all these things. So it just ended up being a much more tumultuous time, but I hope that there's still some humor in here that you can enjoy. The first poem is called Introduction to Disaster Preparedness. While you told me about the bee colony collapse caused by cell phones or maybe Monsanto, I was thinking about a friend who said they found a lump, and another friend finishing chemo and waiting for a scan, and a third who said, my hair is a disaster, and she meant the layers would take forever to grow out. My house is a disaster, she says, my yard, my outfit. When you told me my son is autistic, I thought of his bright eyes and beautiful tears. It's not the life you planned. How our minds and bodies spin apart, like hives of bees confused about whom to follow, flying further and further out to discover what? That they'd flown too far and now are frozen, flightless. How many hives abandoned? We cannot sleep too far from disaster zones. I saw a tornado once in my own front yard, slept through hurricanes, knelt during earthquakes. Did I pray? Did I ask for something then? I only held my breath. When later asked, are you okay? I said, everything is temporary. So that's the first poem in the book. A little grim, but seemed very Apropos for the kind of year we've been having in 2017, this is a little lighter poem about Nancy Drew, Introduction to Girl Detectives. It's important to start with a powder blue car and a locked diary. The mystery is the disappearance of the mother. No role models. The girl detective catches the film noir festival downtown, the theater with patched velvet curtains and fading murals. The images light her up. Silk blouses, nefarious hot rolled hair, pools of blood, dim corridors. She thinks contemporary versions of my character might sport tattoos, nose rings, contempt for law. She has a lot of male friends, but no permanent love interest. Sometimes she thinks it is because she is too good at solving mysteries. She indulges in Shinrin Yoku to soothe her nerves, control her impulse to clean out her purse one more time. She meditates, tries hot yoga, still the tick of that clock in her head. The girl detective says, if you'd been working since 1930, you'd be worn out too. The girl detective's sleeves are getting frayed. One more puzzle to solve, the clock tower whispering, too late, too late. The shadowed hallway leading once more to a tower of books, to solitude, to a storyline where she might once again be the heroine, thumping along, solid as the engine of her blue vintage Mustang convertible. So that's a little homage to Nancy Drew in there. The next poem is called Lessons in Emergency, which of course is a reference to Frank O'Hara's Lessons in Emergency. Learn to break glass, to take what you need with you when you go. Learn to tie shoes quickly, to find the emergency medications, the rations, the earthquake kit. Is it in your car that you feel safest? Your house? Are you one more Lois Lane with sand coming in the windows, trying to break the glass? Are you waiting for some Superman? Are you waiting? Because in the strictest sense, what can you live without? Water, food, toilet paper, a toothbrush, your laptop, your cat, your husband, your little boy, your wait a second, what am I forgetting? Quick, the sirens are blaring, you shove your palms over your ears. Where do you take cover? Do you ever watch your landscape and wonder where it might collapse? Buildings, tunnels, forest groves, bridges. When you watch the earth tear apart like thin skin, you think briefly, everything is so fragile. In the end, you are still yourself a little dustier, a little blood in your hair, maybe a little rattled, but why are you clutching the egg beater in your hand so tight, your fingers still touched with flour? You ask yourself, is this the time for cake? Frank O'Hara tells you to become a blonde, as religious as a profligate Frenchman. You slip his words in your pocket and run. So the next poem is it's supposed to be a humorous poem. I was watching something, I think it was the John Oliver show, talking about a taco truck delivery man who called in a nuclear plant because the nuclear plant was left completely unguarded and he was able to walk right in to deliver tacos, which of course is horrifying to think about. That's what inspired this poem. But it was an accident. Yes, I was the one who left out the open petri dishes of polio and plague next to the plate of pasta. I leaked the nuclear codes, the ones on giant floppy disks from 1982. I fell asleep at the button. I ordered tacos and turned out the lights. How was I to know someone was waiting for the right time? I thought the radio was saying alien attack and headed for the fallout shelter, failing to feed the dogs. I followed evacuation plans. I just followed orders. I was the pilot of the bomber. I was the submarine captain. I steered into the iceberg. I held the scalpel, but I was shaking. I was the one in charge. I was on the red phone saying, do it decisively. I always imagined writing propaganda. How could I possibly see what was coming when they dropped the flyers, when the angry mobs began choking people in the street? I was always good at creating a panic. I never saw the Ferris wheel start its fatal roll. I looked away just as the plane plummeted, as the building burned. I shook my head at disaster, afraid to meet. It was just an accident. It was fate. It was never my hand on the wheel. When you point fingers, point them towards the empty sky. And this one's a little bit more cheerful. I don't write a lot of love poems, so this is called The Last Love Poem. I am obsolete as my ancestors, the Appalachian glass blowers, provoking fire over and over to produce their artifacts. I knew no writing could survive when we started calling the children vectors, when our forests grew heavy with toxic spores. A map, a list, a series of images. What could I write now that would do anything? A poem orphaned, a crystalline ornament with no Christmas in sight, swirled with delicate color, resting gently on a ledge until the inevitable smash. So here in my last moments, let me set down my memories of you, your rough skin, your green eyes, your slightly clumsy hands. We turned and smiled at each other on the ugly concrete glinting with broken glass as someone yelled obscenities and someone else handed out pizza slices to strangers. When we ran out of flour, we learned to bake cookies out of nuts, seeds, flowers. We decided, against all odds, to plant dahlias. Do you see this as a rebellion? That after all this, the poet clings stubborn to romance, to the idea that somehow a small connection, a tiny universe of fire and friction might be preserved. So, let's see. What do you think? One or two more poems? Am I doing okay for time?
Please.
This is Martha Stewart's Guide to the End Times. Of course, you know I love those little drones, so I've stockpiled them. Those and lemons. I've learned the hard way that life without lemons is barely worth living. Animal Husbandry 101. Fill your own organic pantry. Which breed of chicken will give you the best eggs under stress? Page 13. Leave the fondant till later. You can always do a ganache topping for your cupcakes in a pinch. So simple. Evacuation map for New York City, Boston, the Hamptons, with scratch and sniff icons, page 24. Survival skills are just like hostess skills, a little preparation, a little spying with the drones, a little determined, defense-driven hedging of the grounds. Razor wire will go beautifully with your holly thicket. Guide to storing munitions in attractive wicker boxes, page 52. If your water isn't clear as it should be, use up those charcoal filters first, but after, try a solid iodine tablet in your home-dug well. In these times, it's a good thing. Culinary tips for after the megastore raid. Mixed nuts have a long shelf life. Throw in a little rosemary and toast them over an open flame for anytime elegance. More ideas for those family-sized tubs of popcorn, page 68. Now is the time to get out your hurricane lamps. They create a lovely glow in these last days. So this is the last poem I'll read. This is called Epilogue, or A Story for After. I want to tell you a story about how we survived the end of the world. Crouched around a dying fire, I illustrate with shadow puppets the old beat-up van, the velocity of water and sky, the unnameable odds against us. What really sells it? The way the ending goes on forever, moon ebbing closer to the mysterious dark, its craggy face calling out, the sky scattered with falling stars. The way objects are closer than they appear. You next to me, and I remind you, here is where we used to be. Here is where we are. I draw a line in the dirt with a fork and draw a picture, a house made of a square and triangle, a single daisy in the yard, two smiling stick figures. This is what we dreamed of. The day we waited has arrived. No more shotguns or dusty trails lined with diseased corpses. A ship arrives on top of a mountain, heralded by doves. An airplane lands on another planet, seatmates dazed by lack of gravity. We might teach the dragons to dance, learn the alchemy of soil again, rebuild libraries with tales of fantastic voyage. All I need right now is you, the simple weight of your hand, the warmth of your breath, and this last cup of coffee to tell me we are miraculous. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeannine. That was really wonderful. Just a delight, and so great that you're feeling well enough to be with us tonight. It's a particular treat. So we do have quite a few people tuned in, but let's see. Okay, our first question from Kelly Davio, who I think you may know. Jeannine, what's your trick for being funny in dark times?
I have always said that the only way to deal with bad news is to be funny about it. I think that I've always had that kind of personality where I used to watch Mystery Science 3000, you know, the old 1950s horror movies or disaster movies, and making fun of them with the robots as a kid. That's sort of been my coping mechanism for a long time. And I think there's almost no situation. Oh, I saw somebody on Facebook post this yesterday. They said, and when I was young, I used to think, I hope nothing bad happens to me. Now I think that I'm older, I hope if something bad happens to me, I hope at least it's funny, which I thought was a great line for a poet. I just hope it can be funny eventually. That's sort of how I deal with things. And hi, Kelly.
Wonderful. Yeah, I have a friend who says if it's going to be funny later, it might as well be funny now. So
Exactly.
there you go. Right. roll with it. David Vincenti, he just said, what a brilliant pairing of poets. Thank you for putting these two great artists together. He's curious about how technology and technology education informs poetry in any kind of unique way. I hadn't realized you two have a programming background, Jeannine, so that makes three of us in this weird intersection of poetry and technology.
Yes.
I don't know, I think the internet might explode that we're all in one place. So how do you see technology informing poetry for the better, for the worse? Neil, why don't we have you start with that?
I think there's been a number of things. I feel like we're moving into a time period where we're seeing technology shift from being simply on the periphery or as sort of a marker of the landscape that we're in, and becoming increasingly part of the subject matter. Our interactions with technology or our interactions with each other as mediated by technology, and the ways in which that's changing, empathy and changing compassion and changing relationships is now becoming more and more like something that we can talk about. And we're kind of leaving behind sort of a nostalgia for the old pastoral, and we're moving into a reality of, well, no, we live among technology. We are cyborgs in the sense that so much of what we do requires us to interact with the world through technology. So I think that's a big part of it. But I also feel like as more and more people become better educated about software, about coding, as well as engineering and how things work in terms of technology, that there is a shifting in terms of how we think, in terms of composing poetry, how we organize things. I find, like, sometimes I tell people that I write in a recursive fashion, so I write a line, I read it out loud, I listen to what the next line might be and write the second line, read the two out loud, does it make sense? Is it too easy? Reject the line, start over, and then just keep going. And I may have gone through the poem, maybe 30 or 100 times by the time I get to the last line of the poem. And that's all in one sitting. So I think of that as like, that has definitely been, I see that informed by my own coding background. And I also think sometimes of editing as a type of debugging. I read something out loud until it breaks. It's like, oh, there's a break in the logic, or like, oh, that word just doesn't sound right there, and then I stop and I reparse it and I try to figure out what's happening logically as well as what's happening sonically to identify why it might not be working. So I think like the tools that we bring with us from a technology background or education, and the paradigm can be helpful in terms of giving us a different perspective or angle on things that might be hard to do. I mean, we're accustomed, I think, in our Western tradition, to think about poems in an organic way, right? To think about them as bodies to be dissected. And then I think post-industrial revolution and into sort of 20th century, we start to think about them as cars that need to go to a workshop, right? But there's still something kind of fickle and uncontrollable about that sort of machine environment. But now they're kind of black boxes, and so understanding sort of the underlying code of what's actually happening, I feel is much closer to the spirit of what poetry is anyways. It is a type of, a poem is a type of program code for the imagination, that we're giving a small bit of scripted code that is supposed to to turn something, make something come alive in the mind of another person who's never encountered it before. And you know, I think back to like sort of reading Daniel Tiffany's book on, it was called Toy Medium, and he has a chapter on lyric automaton. And he kind of makes this connection between magic spells and incantations, programming code and algorithm, and lyric poetry. And I'd never thought about it in this way before, but they're actually all pretty much the same thing.
Fascinating.
Yeah, this is a great topic. I think it's so fascinating. I thank you, David, for asking about this, because I thought, well, how has AI, for instance, changed the way we think? Has going to Google and searching for things changed the way our brains connect subjects? While Neil was talking, I was noticing we were having a conversation on Twitter at the same time. So things happen now in these concurrent strings that I think that's not the way thought used to happen, or communication between humans. So it'll probably affect the younger kids, like the millennials, way more than us. But I think it can't help but have an impact on our thought processes in ways we won't understand yet. And I was thinking about when I was a kid, I played these text-based games like Zork. It was kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons-based text game, and it was just this beautiful world that you create, and then you could go in and do different things. Now the kids today, their video games of that kind of thing are so elaborate and beautiful. They don't have to imagine what those things are, right? They just go into the worlds and experience them, and the sights, the sounds, they're all very elaborate. So I was thinking, so our experiences of gaming, or there was an AI program called Eliza that you could talk to, and I was thinking about how far AI has come since the 70s when I started using it. When I started programming, we used BASIC, which was almost a word. You could almost write a poem in BASIC. It's a very language-based computer programming language. So I was thinking about all these things, how these things how we tried to break Eliza by cursing at her or asking her weird questions, trying to get her to do something different. And now our AIs would be so elaborate, there's almost no way to break them. Except I think they did break some Microsoft chatbot recently on Twitter. But anyway, I used to work for Microsoft. I love those guys. But yeah, so it's interesting. And do you think also that thinking about things in code makes you think about things different in lyric poetry? You know, it seems like lyric poetry is almost its own coding language. You use different bits together. Here's an image, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's a juxtaposition, you know, here's symbolism, and then you stick them together. It is almost like a code of a kind. So see, take that, STEM people. Poetry can teach you stuff about code. So you know, it's interesting. Anyway, I hope I didn't go on too long, but lots of interesting things to think about there.
I kind of want us to form a collaborative that produces a poetry for programmers manual or textbook of some sort. But I do think like this conversation would be fantastic, you know, in book form, because I do think like other ways in which things parallel is I think about images in the form of like pointers, basically, is that they're a type of like an indirection that points us to another, you know, set of associated ideas. And it could be like a linked list, or it could be like a neural network in terms of the form of multiple connections. And then likewise, something you were talking about earlier also reminds me that we are evolving into a society that thinks in a parallel processing and even writes in a parallel processing sort of way, in which we have multiple threads happening at the same time. And I read more and more like contemporary poetry, in which it is not a single narrative, but it's multiple narratives threaded through. Or there's a text, and then there's embedded within the text is another voice or set of voices undercutting or deconstructing or dismantling whatever the primary narrative set out to be. So I think like Solmaz Sharif is doing that type of work, is completely unpacking and taking apart language that has already been co-opted by the military and returning it back to the body and back to human beings.
Absolutely fascinating. I got you guys onto a good thing with that topic for sure. And you know, as you're talking about how poetry, or how technology, and particularly coding, informs, as you said, your revision process, the way you think about things, the parallel nature of it. I'm just reminded that poetry was really our first ever compression algorithm, right? It was the very first way that in the oral transmission of any kind of lore, we were able to remember things better because, of course, if it's alliterated or rhymed or set to a lyre or what have you, it's a lot easier to remember than full-length prose. So I think poetry has always been a form of technology, actually. And weirdly enough, we just, that, as you said, Jeannine, take that, STEM people, trying to create a.
Yeah, I mean, that piece of poetry or lyric is then executed, and then it becomes a thing larger than just the text.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Especially with multiple authors.
Unpacked in the mind. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Like the Bible or Beowulf or the Odyssey, all these things probably had multiple people kind of snipping bits in and out, right? And altering it the way they wanted to alter it. So.
Wonderful. Great stuff. So yeah, I think David's had to hop off, and Kelly's tuned in, I think, still. But so I had a question as I was hearing both of you kind of read your wonderful work. I was just reflecting on poetry as a kind of survival skill, or as a way of reconciling trauma, grief, just the difficulties of everyday living. Let alone, extraordinary events or circumstances. And I'm really curious to hear from both of you. I think we think of poetry doing that a lot in the confessional vein, right? And when the I means me. But I'm really curious to hear what you think about how that can work through persona, through describing other or even speculative events and circumstances, how poetry can create catharsis, meaning for an individual when it's not necessarily the I that's speaking is the I that's written it. So,
there's
Jeannine, you want to kick off?
Oh yeah. I was just thinking. I literally wrote a poem in Field Guide called "The Narcissist Apocalypse," because I was thinking about how these apocalypse movies and stuff, they help us process our own internal apocalypses, right? Like, as we watch buildings crumble, or we watch bridges fall down, or the earth collide with another meteor, it's similar to the way our own bodies can break down on us. I have, of course, become intimately aware of that process in the last year. But when you write about cancer, can you make that into a metaphor that's new? Because it seems like it's been written about so many different ways. Or lately, I've been writing about neural problems, because one of the problems with MS is, of course, your nerves aren't certain, right? Your memories become uncertain, and your nerves aren't getting their signals right to your hands or your feet. So thinking about that as a process that you can write about in the world. So I've been looking at stories, apocalypses, of course, but other narratives as well, mythology. When I was in a wheelchair for a while, I'm in a wheelchair again right now, and I remember writing about mermaids, because mermaids, of course, can't use their legs. They get on land, they can't walk. So I was like writing about mermaids in wheelchairs. And so I think that our minds are going to try to attach to something that's larger, or something that acts as a new kind of metaphor for the breakdowns that we have physically or mentally. It's been fascinating. All this time I've had all these health crises, I've never quit writing. That's been one of the things that stayed constant. I don't always send stuff out, or I had to cut down on volunteer work and such, but and readings, but the writing is always there. And I've been reading Lucia Perillo, who had MS as well, and her work is such a beautiful confluence of science and suffering. You hate to say it, but her own suffering is made into this beautiful artwork. And she's so funny, she's so smart. It just all comes out in her work. And you think, even after she's passed away now, is that these beautiful lines stay behind to kind of track her as an evolutionary record. This is what humanity does under these circumstances. I think she's a great example of somebody who marries a larger scientific world with the personal in a super successful way.
Mhm.
Wonderful.
I
Neil, I'm
think, you know,
thinking of, yeah, go ahead.
I gravitate towards historical figures, actually. I found, you know, my first book was written and finished during the time period my father was in decline, dying of ALS, of Lou Gehrig's disease. And so, so I was going through that process, and I found like immersing myself in the editing and the completion of that manuscript was helpful, and I could throw myself into it. And then after that book was done and published, and I started working on Babbage's Dream, I thought, oh, I'm going to give myself a break. I'm not going to write about my dad. I'm not going to write about death. I'll write about this 19th century figure and about my love of like technology and code, and that'll be safe. It'll be a place where I could just throw myself. And sure enough, partway through the writing process, I start realizing it's unavoidable. My dad's coming into these things, and as is my personal life. And it's like it was cathartic because I could do it through the safe space of, through the lens or through the film of working with another, you know, figure. But the choice to make the poems about Babbage second-person poems gave me an opportunity not only to speak to Babbage as a historical figure, but also to speak to myself and to speak to a reader, an imagined reader, and kind of bring us all together so we could experience what would instead, like in normal situations, a historical figure, especially like Babbage, would be cast into a distant past, would be thought of as being so distant and different from us that we wouldn't know how to form, you know, an empathetic bond. And I thought, like, the poetry, the work of poetry, can build those bridges and can also allow us to discover in the course of building those bridges what's happening in our own hearts and in our own minds, and find a way to articulate that we didn't know we needed.
That you didn't know you needed. Wow, fascinating. Sounds to some extent like getting away from the personal I has actually, for both of you, been or given you greater scope or latitude to deal with a multitude of eyes, or kind of almost a gestalt multiplicity of selves. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It helps, I think. I think that I think it helps. It's hard to write a good confessional poem. I mean, it's very challenging to write something that's new and fresh. I think it's harder than writing a good persona poem or a good, as Neil was talking about, writing about historical figures, writing about mythology. To me, that seems way easier as a way to get across more personal. You just feel so much less vulnerable when you're writing it too, you know, and you're allowed to say things that you might not be allowed to say as a first person I author, which gives you some freedom.
Yeah, and I think especially in the composing stage, as you're writing them, you trick yourself into believing that you have this distance to be vulnerable. And then in hindsight, when you look back over what you've written, you're like, no. It's like, I was actually pretty vulnerable in that moment. It's like, that's mostly me. That's me in there. So I think that's really powerful. I mean, I do advise a lot of students that if there is something that you find impossible to articulate, you know, some trauma or some tragedy or something, some wound that you can't quite voice, that creating a persona or finding sort of a parallel historical figure or mythological figure to work with gives you the freedom to begin that work of writing about that experience and give you a little bit of distance. And then at the same time, you find, you know, one of my students says, like, this exercise actually gave him the ability to be much more honest with himself than he could be in those first person poems when he first tried to write about some of the experiences he had had.
Fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, I guess to some extent, I guess it is every poem is a self-portrait, even when you're trying to paint a landscape or someone else. Yeah. Curious if, you know, we've got just a few minutes here. Curious if you have questions for each other, things you'd like to know. You obviously really respect one another's work. Neil, do you have a question for Jeannine?
A question for Jeannine. I'm gonna ask what your favorite apocalypse is.
Oh, Meteors are always popular, but of course mine would be Nuclear Winter. That's the one I had nightmares about when I was a kid in the 70s, when they showed us The Day After. Was The Day After Tomorrow the film? Do you guys remember? You guys are my age, right? There was some horrifying film like that. Yeah, so that's probably the nuclear destruction is probably still my nightmare of choice on that, I think. Or Aliens. I'm into Aliens as well.
Do you play any of the video games around these apocalypses?
I have.
Fallout 4.
I've watched them. They're beautiful stories. I'm so enamored now of the storytelling and the visual. I mean, of course, we live in video game heaven over here, so you can walk in. They had an art gallery with video games all over the walls, and they were so beautiful. You just couldn't take your eyes off of them. So I don't play them as much for catharsis as I do to see the pictures and the story. It's really beautiful.
I think one of my favorites is a game I play on again, off again. Is called The Long Dark, and it's all about sort of some strange electromagnetic occurrence happens that wipes out all electricity, and you crash land. Your plane crash lands in northern Canada in the wilderness, and you have to survive with what you have in your pockets.
Oh, that's a good one. I like that.
And you just have to start from scratch, and everyone you encounter is dead.
Oh, cheerful.
It is very, like, you're very isolated, but the landscapes are gorgeous. It's a beautiful game, and it's very contemplative, and at the same time, I've never felt so afraid in a game. Because a lot of times you don't know if you have enough to eat to make it. Like if you go to sleep, you might not wake up. You might die in your sleep because of cold or because you ran out of food energy, or wolves might attack you while you're sleeping or things like that. So it's tough, but it's beautiful.
I think that's a good metaphor for poetry as well. Tough.
The wolves might eat you when you're sleeping.
Questions for Neil about poetry or video games?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to say congratulations, first of all, on your Elgin. I was so pleased to see you won, and I was going to talk to you a little bit about this because I remember you posting about this. How hard was it for you to place those Babbage poems? Did you find finding homes for your speculative work more challenging than your quote unquote regular work? That's something I'd be interested in.
So the ones specifically about Babbage, the historical figure, were surprisingly easy to place. Good. I was really kind of shocked. I thought those would be the hard ones.
Right.
But I do think like some of the ones that went around for a while were often the ones that were about some of the famous AI figures, like so. Or maybe the less famous AI figures, I think, was probably the tougher one. So like the Mechanical Turk one, I think, went around a fair bit, partly because I was just never happy with the earlier versions of the poem. So I'd send it out and then revise it, and then revise it and send it out again. But eventually it got picked up. Yeah, I don't know. It's like, overall, I was really pleased with the reception. I was really kind of shocked and surprised. But I think the timing was kind of critical, was that by the time I was ready to send the poems out, there was this major, popular culture interest in robots and AI. And so, and it was still the tail end of sort of a steampunk interest. So I think it was kind of the sweet spot for many of those poems to go out.
Oh, good. It's nice now. I mean, 10 years ago, I don't think we would have had as easy a time placing these kinds of poems. I said,
yeah,
it was just so much harder to place speculative work in the olden days. Back 10 years ago. So.
Now I feel like there are actual journals that are specifically catering and looking for work that is of a more speculative nature and or more deeply references pop culture in interesting ways. And I think that's really exciting to live in a period where we don't have to feel like one set of topics or themes is the only are the only ones that we're allowed to write about.
I knew things were changing when I saw a Game of Thrones poem in Poetry Magazine.
Yes, absolutely.
I was like, times are shifting. Things are changing. I think you're right. I think even mainstream journals are more open now to these topics, which is nice. I think getting science and code and robots and these kinds of things into the mainstream poetry world, it can only be good.
It can only be good. Yes.
It can only be good indeed. Well, it's been a real pleasure to have both of you as, you know, vanguards for sure of the speculative poetry world, now coming into your own, and much deserved. So this is the last broadcast, and a great one to go out on for 2017. And as I've been hinting, we do have a special announcement, which is that the 2018 season will be curated by two new people. So I'll be stepping down as the main curator, and John Gossley in the U.S. and Monique Crumpler based in Paris will be taking over the curation. So they'll be working with our existing partners and with hosts that you've seen in the past, as well as bringing their own new poets to the fore. So I'm delighted about this. This always has been my vision, that that this become, you know, a larger community effort, that we'd be able to share the work of poets like Jeannine and Neil globally through the use of technology, and really many hands make light work. So you may not see as much of this space on the hosting side of things, but I will be absolutely behind the scenes supporting this 100% as I have up till now. We've been going more than 4 years now, and it's just been an absolute pleasure to do these broadcasts, to bring poets like these to your living rooms. So stay tuned. We'll have more to announce about the 2018 season later on this year. Meanwhile, from me and from all of us that make this transatlantic poetry thing happen, thank you so much. Do check out Jeannine and Neil's books and work online, and we'll see you again in the new year. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.